Black Americans are Africans, stupid. Knowing the history of black civilizations reinvigorates your mind and spirit. Many whites and ignorant blacks are against Afrocentrism because it teaches historical truths about the history of black African people, while consensus history sustains white supremacy. Today, some black people, due to self-hate and ignorance, hate being black and an African. As a result, they claim to be anything else but African. They call themselves Native Americans or Asians. These dumb Negroes are trying to make a revision of black American history. Negro is a term some Afro-Americans use to refer to blacks who are sellouts to white supremacy. These people are sometimes also called coconuts and Uncle Toms because they hate themselves and wish they were white, European, instead of black African. These Negroes believe in their own inferiority. Yes, they believe black people are inferior and deny their African and black Native American origins. Some people believe the study of ancient civilizations is a waste of time. This is false. Europeans spend millions of dollars to support university historians and anthropologists studying ancient history. They would not spend all this money for the study of ancient civilizations if this was a waste of time. Amos Wilson in the Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy believes that the African spirit and mind can be healed through the advancement of African-centered historiographic, social, and natural sciences. Wilson wrote, "Apparently the rewriting, the distortion, and the stealing of our history must serve vital economic, political, and social functions for the Europeans, or else he would not bother and try so hard to keep our history away from us and distort it in our own minds." To Wilson, we should see history as psychohistory, since the aim of writing black people out of history is to destroy any sense of intellectual or social self-esteem for African people. Wilson noted that, in the final analysis, European history's principal function is to first separate us from ourselves and separate us from the reality of the world, to separate us from the reality of our history, and to separate us from its ramifications. Wilson maintains that we must study Afrocentric history because Europeans use history as a way of maintaining white supremacy, and the study of history by blacks is a threat to the status quo. Some black people believe that the writing of history is neutral. Writing history is not neutral. Black people across the United States have rarely had the opportunity to study their history. Most blacks would prefer not to know their history because they are ashamed of the fact that the ancestors of most black Americans were slaves and had been slaves for 400 to 300 years. Ignorant, self-hating blacks believe three lies. 1. The Atlantic slave trade is a myth. 2. We are not Africans, we are just Native Americans. And 3. Africans did not sell other Africans into slavery. These three myths dominate the minds and souls of many self-hating black people. To erase the horrible memory of slavery, some African Americans deny the slave trade ever took place, and that Africans did not fully and actively participate in the Atlantic slave trade. I'm sorry to say that the slave trade was not extortion. The African ruling class and elites actively participated in the slave trade for their own gain. The noted Caribbean scholar Walter Rodney wrote, "With the coming of the Atlantic slave trade, however, it was noticeable that the rulers acted more like a separate class which had no sympathy for the common people. The African ruling class took such a leading role in the slave trade that often within their own tribes they prevented anyone else from trading with Europeans, so that all commerce was in their hands. Because the slave trade became the main business of West African societies, there arose a number of professional slave hunters. They worked together in large bands, usually led by one of the great men or chiefs, and they concentrated their efforts on raiding for slaves. Obviously, raiding and warfare are associated with attacks by one people on another, so that here the factor of tribal divisions was present. It should also be pointed out, however, that the ruling class normally managed to evade being captured and sold. Alternatively, if they were captured, they could be ransomed by offering common people to take their place. One of the things the Europeans in West Africa learned to avoid was to sail away with an African noble in their slave ships, so long as that noble had not been voluntarily given up by his fellows. Such action would endanger the lives and property of the Europeans in the area from which noble was taken away. As you can see, Africans in Africa did participate in the slave trade. In fact, many African rulers found it as a lucrative way to increase their riches. When Gates of Harvard University did a special in Africa some years ago, there was no remorse from the descendants of African slave trading families. This is not surprising, because Rodney noted this aspect of slavery which is rarely discussed. Shamefully, people prefer the myth that Europeans forced Africans to participate in the slave trade, instead of the duplicity of most African elites and kings in this terrible trade. Yes, we are Native Americans, but this does not make us Asians. Africans have been selling to America for 100,000 years. Yes, 100,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, Africans settled in Brazil. These settlers of Brazil probably were Australians who lived in Africa. Yes, the people who live in Australia today originally lived in Africa, and from there they migrated to other parts of the world. We know that these people who settled Brazil 100,000 years ago had to have come from Africa because the ice shields made it impossible to walk or sail to America from Europe or Asia. These first Americans or Paleo-Americans lived in Brazil and other parts of South America. By 24,000 BC, the Cochin people settled the Americas and introduced a so-called Solutrean culture to North America. Archaeologists call one of these Africans who settled Brazil Luzia. As you can see, the Paleo-Americans, these people were black Africans. They came from Africa. They didn't just appear in the Americas. They sailed here. In 1310, Abubakari of the ancient African empire Mali sailed to America with 25,000 followers in search of a new land. These Africans left hundreds of inscriptions that some researchers believe are Phoenician. These are not Phoenician inscriptions. The Phoenicians, they may have come to America, but they did not leave these inscriptions. These inscriptions were written by the followers of Abubakari. They are written in the Vai language. Abubakari and his followers left us hundreds of inscriptions and built mounds along the Mississippi River. As you can see from the presence of mounds, artifacts found in the mounds, and ancient inscriptions from the mounds, Africans have been settling and colonizing the Americas for 100,000 years. Therefore, I can say I am an Afro-American because both my Native American and black American slave ancestors were both Africans. In the 1960s, some blacks avoided facing the fact that their African and black Native American ancestors had been slaves by saying their ancestors were Asian, Moors, or Hebrews. Since the 1960s, these black people who consider themselves Hebrew, black Hebrews, or Moors, say that they're Asian. This is impossible. Some black Hebrews believe that man originated in the Americas when America was part of Gondwana land. This is impossible because anatomically modern humans only appear around 200,000 years ago. Gondwana land on the other hand, is the name given to an ancient supercontinent believed to have existed between about 570 to 510 million years ago. There were no human beings on the planet 570 million years ago, and yet some Hebrews teach that man was in Gondwanaland. The other blacks who call themselves black Hebrews believe that they are Asians. These Hebrews claim Africans are Hamites and that Hamites or Africans were destined to be slaves. This is a silly and stupid idea. The Hamites were not cursed as slaves. It was not Ham who was cursed, it was his son Canaan. In Genesis 9:18-25, in the Bible we read, "When Noah woke from his wine, he knew that his youngest son had done to him. So he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers.'" Noah also said, according to the Bible, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." As you can see, there's no mention of any Hamites. They talk about Canaan. The Canaanites were probably Y chromosome J1, which is common to the Levant. As a result, it was the people in the Levant, Canaanites and Hebrews, who lived in the region, not Africans who were cursed, not the Hamites or Africans that lived on the African continent and other parts of the Americas and Eurasia. The heritage of the Hebrews as slaves probably explains why they were first said to have been slaves of the Egyptians and later the Assyrians. The Assyrians who took them as slaves from Israel back to Assyria. Since the Assyrian destruction of Israel, Hebrews have lived in foreign lands as a minority to serve the needs of the dominant population in the lands where they lived. This seems to appear that the so-called black Hebrews are the ones who were slaves. The Hebrews were Africans who fled ancient Egypt into what we called ancient Israel. Yes, have you forgotten? The first Hebrews lived in Egypt, so they were Africans. The Hebrews, when they were taken to Assyria, were still African in appearance like their Egyptian ancestors. Some people who call themselves Moors also claim they are Asians. This is a stupid lie because Moors live in Africa. Here are some pictures of Moors. They don't look like Asians to me. They don't look like Chinese or Southeast Asians, and they definitely don't look like Arabs. The Moors, as evident in these pictures, were Africans, not Asians. As you can see, these Hebrews and Moors looked African just like their African ancestors from Egypt. They were not Asians. Afro-Americans who do not know their history believe whatever whites or Europeans teach them. For example, these ignorant blacks claim the Atlantic slave trade never took place, and only a few hundred or a few thousand Africans came to America as slaves. It was W. Du Bois, though, who said 100 million Africans were taken during the Atlantic slave trade from Africa. In 1969, Philip D. Curtin created the myth only 10 million Africans were enslaved. Du Bois visited archives throughout Europe to conduct his research. Curtin didn't do the extensive research like Du Bois. Millions of Africans were sold into slavery and died during the Middle Passage. Slavery in Latin America was different from slavery in the United States. During much of the history in Latin America, slaves were usually worked to death, and then slaveholders would just purchase more slaves. As a result, in Latin America, they needed millions of slaves to replace the slaves who were worked to death. In the United States, on the other hand, they didn't work their slaves to death, they breeded slaves. Just like you breed cattle, or some people breed pit bulls or other dogs today. As a result, the Native Americans and African slaves mixed freely on the plantation. This is why Afro-Americans have both Native American and direct African ancestry. Some people use the Curtin book and the Emory database on slavery to support the idea that there were few slaves in America. These sources, the Emory database and the Curtin book, are BS. As a result of the Curtin Book and Emory database, some black people deny the slave trade ever happened. They deny the cruelty that black people suffered and the fact 60 million people lost their lives during the slave trade. In addition to denying that the slave trade happened, other blacks say they were not African because Native Americans were also made into slaves, and therefore we are just Native Americans. This is true for the most part. I have an Indian heritage, for example. But these stupid blacks forget that the black Native Americans were enslaved on the same plantations as the African slaves. On these plantations, both Africans direct from Africa and Afro-Indians suffered the same cruelty. Most Mongoloid Indians, on the other hand, they weren't used to farming, they were nomads. So as a result, white people didn't make Mongoloids into slaves. At the website Law in Colonial Virginia, we read about how slaves were punished. Black slaves, however, could still be stripped naked and then lashed at the whip of the masters. Slaves, in fact, could be subjected to a whole list of punishments declared inappropriate for white servants during these years. Branding, burning, dismemberment. Few checks were placed on the imagination of the slaveholder in punishing his slaves. William Byrd II, for example, employed a grotesquely unorthodox set of methods to discipline his slaves. One young boy was repeatedly forced to drink his own urine in order supposedly to break him of the habit of bedwetting. Other slaves were forced to wear a bit, much like a horse, in order to control their behavior. As you can see, in the American South, you would usually find a black man on a stake to remind the slaves what would happen to them if they tried to run away. The water torture outlined by the CIA for terrorists was a common punishment for black slaves. Ignorant blacks denying slavery are no better than those blacks who whipped their fellow slaves. Shame on you, stupid Negroes. The Emory database and Curtin Book is a lie. There were more than 10 million Africans sold into slavery. Many people have forgotten the maxim our grandparents taught us. White people lie about black history. For example, the Emory database figures estimate that between 1776 and 1800, around 23,000 slaves came to the United States. This estimate is far too low because the American slave trader, Mark Anthony DeWolf, brought 10,000 slaves to the United States on his own during this period. From 1787 to 1807, the DeWolfs financed at least 96 voyages. I will repeat, 96 voyages bringing over 10,000 slaves to the Americas. Some ignorant black people, they believe in the sense that the pictures of slave trips are a lie. But the DeWolfs had 96 voyages and they brought 10,000 slaves to the Americas. The DeWolfs were the main slave trading family. If one family of American slavers took 10,000 by themselves, there had to have been more than 23,000 slaves landed in America during this period, given the large number of American slavers. Also, if he only had 96 voyages to America, on many of these voyages, there must have been as many as hundreds of slaves. Let's not forget these estimates only account for slaves from West Africa sold by Rhode Island slavers. They failed to discuss slaves from Southeast Africa, which were also sold in the United States. Just looking at the DeWolf's importation of slaves, the Emory figures are far too low. In the Negro, Du Bois wrote, "The exact proportion of the slave trade can be estimated only approximately. From 1680 to 1688, we know that the English African Company alone sent 249 ships to Africa. shipped there 60,783 Negro slaves, and after losing 14,387 on the Middle Passage, delivered 46,391 in America. It seems probable that 25,000 Negroes a year arrived in America between 1698 and 1707. After the Asiento of 1713, this number rose to 30,000 annually, and before the Revolutionary War it had reached at least 40,000 and perhaps 100,000 slaves a year. The total number of slaves imported into the United States is not known. Dunbar estimates that nearly 900,000 came to America in the 16th century, continued W. B. Du Bois. 2,750,000 in the 17th, 7 million in the 18th, and over 4 million in the 19th, perhaps 15 million in all. Certainly it seems that at least 10 million Negroes were expatriated. Probably every slave, noted W. B. Du Bois, imported represented on the average 5 corpses in Africa or on the high seas. The American slave trade therefore meant the elimination of at least 60,000 Negroes from their fatherland. The Mohammedan slave trade meant the expatriation or forceful migration in Africa of nearly as many more. It would be conservative then to say that the slave trade cost Negro Africa 100 million souls. And yet people ask today the cause of the stagnation of culture in that land since 1600. Such a large number of slaves can only be organized by slave raiding in every corner of Africa. The African continent gradually became revolutionized. Whole regions were depopulated. Whole tribes disappeared. Villages were built in caves or built in forests. The character of people like those benign developed their worst excesses of cruelty instead of the already flourishing arts of peace. The dark, irresistible grasp of the fetish took firmer hold on the minds of men. If we accept the estimates of Du Bois, the fact remains that as many as 15 million slaves probably came to the United States, based on some estimates. These estimates are based on the Royal African Company voyages. To avoid paying taxes, many American slave voyages were not always recorded in these estimates. The best example of these figures relate to Southeast Africa. Statistics for trade in Southeast Africa indicate in the memory database estimates are far too low. Let's look at the trade in slaves from Malagasy and Mozambique. In D.P. Mannix and M. Cowley's 1962 book Black Cargoes, History of the Atlantic Slave Trade, 1518 to 1865, we can find some many interesting facts about the trade in slaves from Madagascar. In this book, we learned that American slave traders collected slaves in East Africa and Madagascar and sold them throughout the United States. They took slaves from Madagascar and East Africa because the British Royal African Company monopolized the trade on the West African shore. In 1680, the first Malagasy slaves and slaves from up the Mozambique Channel were sold in New England. According to Mannix and Cowley, Governor Broadstreet of the state of Massachusetts in 1680 observed that Malagasy slaves were between 40 or 50 Negroes, mostly women and children. The Royal African Company was upset about the trade in Malagasy and Mozambique slaves. Mannix and Cowley report that in 1683, the Royal African Company claimed that as many as 900 slaves were transported to the United States every 2 months from Madagascar and Mozambique. In 1721, the Royal African Company began to import slaves from Madagascar and Mozambique. Using the figures of the RAC for 1683, 6 times 900, or 5,400 slaves were sold in the United States by American slave traders. We can conservatively estimate that between 1683 and 1721, for example, around 205,000 slaves entered the United States just from Madagascar and Mozambique. The Emory database claims only 50,000 slaves were taken to the United States between 1680 and 1725, when the actual number had to have been more than 205,000 came just from Madagascar and Mozambique alone. This shows the Emory database is BS. The trade in Malagasy slaves did not end after the RAC began importing slaves from Southeast Africa, according to Mannix and colleagues. Malagasy slaves were still coming into the United States as late as 1806. The Royal Africa Company did not begin taking slaves from Southeast Asia or Africa until 1721. This was 30 years after American slaves had been transporting 5,000 slaves a year from this region. We will never know the exact estimate of slaves that came to the United States, but what we do know is that the Emory figures for the United States are far too low. As you can see, it is a lie that no slaves were sold in America. The various colonizations of North America by Africans in the past 100,000 years make it clear black people in the United States, including Native Americans, are Africans. As a result, it is a lie that black Americans are not Africans. Blacks migrated from Africa to settle the Americas and Eurasia. The Caucasian, the so-called white man, was born in Central Asia. From there, he migrated into Europe. The present-day Mongoloid people originated in East and Southeast Asia, and today you find them in the Pacific Islands and in the Americas. Stop being dumb and embrace your true history as a black Native American and African. Black or African people can belong to more than one male genetic line because African people possess all the major DNA haplogroups.